Muted, Julie.
Can you unmute me? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for that, Mr. Driggs. This is the January 13th meeting of the Transportation and Planning Committee. My name is Julie Eisold. I'm the committee chair, and we'll go ahead and start with our introductions from the committee members, and then we'll go around the room. So may I have the committee members who are online with us introduce themselves?
Good morning, Larkin Eggleston, Committee Vice Chair.
Malcolm Graham, committee member.
And our guest council member?
Is that me?
Yes,
That's very,
yes.
District Sitman. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Then we'll go around the room and then go to staff online. So Lynn, do you want to introduce yourself?
Lynn Alexander, Charlotte Department of Transportation.
Alan Goodwin, planning staff.
Yolanda Jones, planning staff.
Allison Craig, interim planning director.
John Lewis, Executive Director, Charlotte Area Transit System.
Okay, how about in the back?
Blake Redden, Charlotte Fire, Strategic Planning.
Brandon Hunter, Cats.
Jason Lawrence, Cats.
And McKinney, CDOT.
Kelly Goforth, Cats. Sandra Montgomery, planning.
Mariah Wozniak, planning.
Laura Harmon, planning.
And how about online?
Babson with CDOT.
Good morning, Kevin May, planning staff.
Anyone else, staff or guests? Okay, great. With that, we're going to jump right in. I always say we have a full agenda. Today we have a really full agenda. So hopefully we can get through as much as possible in the next 2 hours. We've got 5 agenda items. The first one will be easy to knock off. It's our 2022 meeting schedule, and I will turn it over to Liz Babson online for that.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Real quickly, we'll go through this. We're requesting that the committee approve the additional meeting on July 11th of 2022 to the current adopted 2020-2022 TAP meeting schedule. And so I think we were going to try to have that on the screen. We did not previously have a July meeting scheduled in our adopted meeting schedule.
Okay, may I?
I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Liz. May I have a motion to adopt?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
is there a specific motivation for us having it? I'm sorry, never mind, disregard. We do have a council meeting that night.
Yeah, we do.
So motion to adopt the amended calendar.
I'll second that. Mr. Graham, are you? Well, there's just 3 of us, so we'll go ahead and vote. And unless there's any other comments? Okay, I'm a yes. Mr. Eggleston?
Yes.
And Mr. Graham?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That will get added to the calendar then. The second item is Mr. Lewis is going to give us an update with the Lynx Gold Line. And then we will have, and this is with regards to the follow-up questions from the May 31st council meeting. Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the TAP Committee. This is just an opportunity, and thank you for adding us to the agenda. We brought the Gold Line Phase 3 item to council at the May 31st council meeting. There were a number of questions that council members had, and we pushed the item back to tonight's meeting. Over the last week, I've been meeting with many of you one-on-one and in small groups, and I just wanted to take this final opportunity. If there were any additional questions or concerns, I'd love to be able to address those now.
Do we have any questions from the committee? How about from Mr. Driggs? Okay. Mr. Lewis, thank you for that opportunity to get that clarification. I know that it answered the questions I had from the May 31st meeting. And so we'll look forward to making a decision on that tonight.
Very good. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Okay, the third item is the strategic mobility action, or the strategic mobility plan. and we will have an update on that. And we will start with, are we starting with you, Ed, or with? Okay,
think so,
Mr.
yeah.
McKinney, thank you.
Thank you. Again, Ed McKinney with Charlotte Department of Transportation. And what we want to do today is just quickly talk a little bit about the process, some of the engagement, and really the steps moving forward, specifically because we spent so much time just last week with full council at the strategy session, kind of walking through more of the details of the draft. Again, what I want to do today is just highlight a little bit of the process and some of the things that we're doing moving forward for adoption. So if you go to the next slide, that's just the agenda. You go to the next slide, just a reminder and a summary from our discussion last week about what's in the draft of the strategic mobility plan. So the way I would simply describe it is three basic things. The vision, really the details of the mobility policy, and then some specific details around the strategy, really the actions we're going to be taking moving forward. Two things as a reminder, this kind of came up a little bit last week, is the vision and the policy really is pulled and built directly upon the comprehensive plan. And so the vision itself and the specifics around those 6 policy goals really come directly from the comprehensive plan. And what this study and this plan does is really just take it to another level of detail. So we just build upon that work and sort of describe for us what are the more specific things we need to do that really where the comprehensive plan left off. This is really sort of adding the kind of flesh and detail to it from a mobility policy standpoint. And then the third piece is, and we talked about this before, we kind of broke sort of the strategy in more detail. We looked at the different modes and then described more closely the kinds of projects and priorities that we would have. So sort of taking the policy and then saying, okay, what are the projects? How should we be investing? Where are our priorities and focus around the next steps in terms of the investment we want to make in the broader mobility investment as we move forward? Particularly, again, as we talked about on Monday, helping us prioritize the programmatic capital dollars, things like the bike program or the pedestrian program, Vision Zero. That strategy helps us talk and think about those things in more detail and will help us sort of prioritize projects and investment. Next slide, a couple things I want to just emphasize into really around the building of this plan and some of the engagement activities that we've done. A snapshot on the one side of this slide just describes and shows a few of the things that are documented and sort of covered in the plan. I want to highlight kind of what we did and where some of all of that input and those words come from. We did a series of citywide surveys, covered and actually got participation from over 4,000 respondents. So we've got lots of really good specific information, things about priorities and the desires of the community around, again, 34 questions with over 4,000 participants. We also did sort of working in more detail. We really did try to get to a more specific geographic set of discussions. So we took really the area plan geography from the comprehensive plan and then orchestrated a series of kind of neighborhood conversations. So we did that in a set of key geographies and again got via online kind of input sessions, really got again, a good sense of specifics and more geographic focus, priorities, and ideas from the community. Related to that, we also had an online map. So we really promoted that work, again, last fall with a lot of the work that was happening both with the policy map and the UDO. We had an online map where folks could literally click on the map specific to an intersection or to an area within their neighborhood and give us, again, feedback, whether it was project related, whether it was here's a safety issue or we want to see a bike facility. Again, over 1,000 comments on that. Helped us, again, focus where some of our priorities should be and get a sense of where the community is. Another thing I'll say about that is lots of really good project information. So none of that information goes away. We're actually using that to help us as we move forward in terms of thinking about the kinds of projects that we would do. So it's actually a living set of information that will help us moving forward. We also did a series of focus groups. As we know, there's the kind of participation we do. Sometimes we have to go and be more proactive. So we had part of our team we covered 85 participants, really in some specific things, Spanish language specific. We looked at students. In this case, we focus on J.C. Smith University, and again, tried to get some more specific kind of conversational input from the kinds of groups that aren't participating in the normal things we do. So again, I just wanted to highlight all of that work. And again, that work is documented in some very specific ways, as you see from this slide, in the plan with lots of specific detail. And then certainly all of that thematically and specifically gets reflected both in the policy priorities and then more specifically the strategy work we did around projects and investment. Go to the next slide. Just as a reminder, again, the plan then, the full plan and the full draft was released on May 20th. We did a whole series of sort of media outreach to get that word out, working with our communications team. We did a press release on that day. We actually orchestrated a government channel sort of session. Allison Craig with planning helped me do that, sort of similar to some of the things that the planning team did around the UDO. So we kind of did a little TV show that sort of described what this plan was about, how it relates to the comprehensive plan. Again, all of that really to get the word out so that we could drive folks to the engagement session. So again, got some really great media coverage. The notion of that 50-50 goal certainly got a lot of attention. We did a great session with some folks on Charlotte Talks later that week, and then some very specific stakeholder reach. And we had, again, a working list of participants that we sent the word out via email. Next slide just talks about what we're hearing then. So we set up, again, an online public input for the draft. You could go through chapter by chapter. Online kind of provides specific comments, page by page or chapter by chapter. So far, we're going to be essentially closing that comment out tonight as we get into the public comment tonight at council. But as a snapshot from sort of midweek last week. I didn't get the most latest numbers, but we got, again, over 120 very specific comments. Some of the, to give you a sense of what we're hearing, is certainly, strong support for the vision. Not surprising, it's consistent with the work from the comprehensive plan. Good, some excitement from some folks around this 50-50 vote shift, this idea that we have a really aspirational vision that we're trying to achieve, but then certainly some question about, can we do it? And, some skepticism about, our commitment around that. There's some desires for some more project-specific information. This plan, the strategic plan, wasn't really intended to get into specific projects, corridor by corridor, but we're certainly hearing from folks that that's the next thing they want to see. Okay, how are we going to be investing? And that's really the work we'll be doing around the implementation, more feasibility, and then those are the kinds of projects that come back for council as we talk more specifically around capital investment program. What's not on the slide, but just a little conversation from our folks looking again back at the comments. Loud and clear, and probably some of the most comments we're getting around are safety. And so really emphasizing that as a priority. They want to and sort of support the notion that's in this plan around Vision Zero and our commitment to safety. As you know, safety and equitable approach is really embedded in our basic vision. So again, good support, and it's just a reminder about probably one of the most important things that we're hearing from the community around mobility and transportation is safety. And as you know, we're very committed to that, both through our current actions and the commitment we've had around Vision Zero. Go to the next slide. Just to talk about schedule. So as you know, we went to the full council last week at the strategic session to talk about it in more detail. We again released the draft on the 20th. We're here today talking to the committee, and then tonight at council we'll have it'll be open for public comment. So that'll be an opportunity for the community to talk more specifically. You'll hear directly from folks tonight, and then we're gearing up for a council adoption on June 27th. I sort of forgot to mention, but again at the top of that slide, in addition to that outreach we did from a media standpoint, we also conducted, about a week or so after that draft was released, some very specific virtual engagement sessions. So we did, a day and an evening session over a couple weeks to, again, give the community once the draft was released, another opportunity to give us some feedback. So I'm going to stop. That was around the strategic mobility plan. I do also want to transition and talk a little bit about this Charlotte Streets Manual. And those are two things, as we've talked about with you before, and we mentioned it last week with council. There are two really important things that cover sort of the mobility approach and the strategy we have, again, with the notion that everything we're doing is supportive in trying to implement the comprehensive plan and then the Unified Development Ordinance as it moves forward. So as we've talked about before, the Streets Manual is a completely separate document. I've got a draft here. That draft was released as part of the UDO last week. We'll talk a little bit about that. But I want to remind you again what's in that plan and what's really driving that manual. Number one is the Comprehensive Transportation Review Guidelines. Again, a mouthful, but the notion that we're really transitioning and updating how we approach traffic impact studies and review and mitigation related to our development. And again, we're using the UDO as a great opportunity to refresh that vision. I'll talk a little bit about and remind us about the approach, but as you can imagine, we're trying to be more multimodal and again, achieve all the things that are in our vision. Number two is a series of driveway and access guidelines. Those are really things we're just pulling forward from our current policies, really more technical around how we guide the specific site development and sort of specific location and design of access and driveways. The next thing, the streets map, the third piece of this, that's the next big thing. And again, we've talked about that in some detail. I'll talk a little bit more of that in a moment just to remind us about what that is and how it relates to the Unified Development Ordinance. I think that's actually the next slide. So if you move to the next slide, just again, a snapshot. We've talked about this before with the committee. What the streets map is. And I just use this slide as to kind of both in a very detailed way and maybe at a high level way to describe what it is. We've taken all of our arterial streets. We define street sort of classifications on this slide. It's sort of an example of what we would call a boulevard. We've evaluated and sort of defined, the basic components. What are the sort of lane configuration and how many lanes do we need? What's the expectation around our bicycle facilities? What's our expectation around the sidewalk and pedestrian facilities? And then that sets a very specific sort of dimension so that as development occurs on all of these corridors, we know what we need to protect for. And then that drives a very specific kind of dimensional line and classification that's directly related to the Unified Development Ordinance. You can't see all the details, but those are two examples of sort of the specific charts that relate to development, zoning category by zoning category that's in the UDO. And there's lots of very specific references back to the street type. The setback that development occurs is calibrated off the dimensions and specifics of that streets map. And so, again, just to emphasize the point of the relationship between this work and how we're going to implement the Unified Development Ordinance. It's not new. Again, another thing to reference is we did a first version of implementing this notion of a streets map when council adopted the update to the TOD ordinance back in, I think it was 2017. And so we've got several years of kind of, testing and working through that. I think it has been working very well. And again, it's a good example of how we're tying mobility investment, ensuring that we're protecting for the corridors and the infrastructure that we need tied specifically to the rules and expectations around development in the zoning and the Unified Development Ordinance. Next slide, just to talk again as a reminder, what's in the Comprehensive Transportation Review Guidelines, the CTR. And again, a simple way to think about this is it's just a modern, sort of a modern version of our current traffic impact study guidelines. And those guidelines are what sort of define as a rezoning comes in, how we evaluate those projects, and helps us really define the kind of mitigation as transportation mitigation as development occurs. What we're doing new is really the top two things, number 1 and 2. And so again, back to our goals, we've set up sort of a new structure and definition about the multimodal infrastructure we need, the sort of pedestrian and kind of transit access, things like fixing ADA ramps, better access to transit, sidewalk gaps, pedestrian crossings, et cetera. And so we've got, again, some very transparent, specific expectations based on the nature of the development to allow us to more predictably have those conversations and get that kind of investment as development occurs. Number two is around this notion of transportation demand management. That's specifically tied to our more intense places, activity centers, and even more specifically around our transit stations. And so where we know we have intensity and that sort of multimodal, specifically transit investment, we know that one of the things we can be doing is working with development to, do everything we can to essentially reduce trips. It's really taking trips off the road. And the sort of basic great example is just as development occurs and employers invest in our transit stations, South End's a great example. This would allow us to have a specific conversation with them about, supporting things like transit passes, having facilities on site for bike shower and access to, again, promote the ability of folks to commute using that investment. And certainly there's some transit stop and bus improvements. We talked most recently with CATS, and around the work that they're doing on the bus priority study and these bus priority corridors, where we want to support CATS in the implementation of mobility hubs. And again, this would be a part of the tool that we would do that through development process. And then the last thing, number three, is just what we already do with a little bit of new definition around how we evaluate traffic, vehicular traffic, and still in some cases do the traffic impact studies, so we know when there are high growth places, we're actually still needing and wanting to make sure that we get the type of traffic mitigation that makes sense. If you go to the next slide, just to give a little bit of detail around that, is on the traffic studies, we've also defined sort of a low intensity and a high intensity categories. And again, as a reminder, what we do today is we treat everything the same. We have a basic threshold, in this case 2,500 trips, which is our basic threshold that would trigger a traffic study. What we've recognized is Charlotte is just too big and too diverse to have that one size fits all. And so we have places that we defined, again, calibrated specifically to the zoning categories that are in the draft UDO, both high and low intensity. And so we've lowered the trigger a little bit in the high intensity, but kept it higher than what we're saying in the low intensity. The basic reason around that is we know in the higher intensity places, transit stations and activity centers, what we want to promote is all the things I just described, right? We want to promote access to transit. We want to promote the kind of multimodal infrastructure. And so we know that really the emphasis, while some big projects still need that evaluation, we know the real emphasis wants to be around multimodal access. On the low intensity places, some of our more suburban places, out in the Charlotte East area is a good example, or down in Steel Creek, where we know we still have some pretty important basic transportation and vehicular infrastructure that's needed. We've lowered the threshold pretty dramatically, down from 2,500 to 1,500. Again, with the goal that we know we have some opportunities through those kinds of projects in our more suburban areas to be getting the kind of vehicular investment we still need. Not to defer the notion that even in those projects we're doing the multimodal things I've already described, but we know we need the ability to make sure we're getting the traffic impact at the same time. This next slide, this is a lot, but I want to really emphasize the engagement that went into the streets manual. And so we did a lot of things last fall, sort of building upon the work that the planning department was doing with the policy map. So we used some of those opportunities to talk about this work and the draft streets map and the things that were in the manual. We did the same thing in the fall as the UDO went out. So we were involved in all of the physical, in-person and virtual sessions that were part of that. We did some additional technical work group sessions with all the kinds of local consultants and experts that do the typical traffic impact studies. So we, had some very specific conversations about how this new approach would actually work and got some great feedback. We worked with the development stakeholder group, again, that the planning team and Unified Development Ordinance team have been working through even in the last several months with some very specific and some pretty focused conversations, again, around these new guidelines and how they work. Bigger development industry groups, I just, again, trying to emphasize everything we've done, ULI, NAIOP, REBIC, so we've been to their board meetings, again, both getting the word out, but then having some very specific conversations with them, and again, both some other organizations around sort of the broader environmental folks and kind of advocacy groups around, these broader goals we have around multimodal investment. Just to emphasize, moving forward, we're doing all the things and kind of building upon the engagement that planning is doing since the draft UDO came out. So there's a series of sessions even this week around the UDO, the open house, some of the virtual office hours. We've set up just some additional stakeholder groups. So we've got one later this week where we're using center city partners to help us facilitate a meeting, again, with lots of development interests, both in Uptown and South End and throughout the city. We're going to be talking with them very specifically around this new draft. And then we also have, like we've done before, some virtual sessions that we're going to be doing in the next couple of weeks. So a lot there, but again, to emphasize, we've been doing a lot of engagement, a lot of work, some very specific things with technical groups and the development community to really make sure that there's a level of awareness, and we've gotten lots of great feedback. If you go to the next slide, just to summarize some of that in terms of the feedback we've gotten and some of the changes that we've made in the next draft. Next slide. So again, through all the public comment, we had an online version. Again, that was open the same way the Unified Development Draft was open. So back in the fall, the draft came out. We've been getting comments from essentially October to March. In addition to all those engagement efforts I just described. Through that process, we got over 450 very specific comments. We've been responding to those, and we essentially have a draft of all the responses to those comments that came out with the draft of these guidelines back on June 3rd. And then just to highlight on this slide, some of the key things that came from all that engagement. So I won't go through all of those in details, but I want to emphasize the notion that there were some very productive, useful things that all of this engagement helped us focus on. Probably one of the just to give you one example, this notion of fee in lieu. So one of the conversations we've had with the development community is the kinds of mitigation we're doing, we really want and need them to be building themselves as they do it. But some of the sort of off-site things we've been talking about, like a pedestrian crossing or sort of fixing some of the sidewalk infrastructure gaps. In some cases, there's right-of-way issues or there's just sort of feasibility issues that make it hard for them to do in the time frame that they're doing development. So in this case, they said, can we define a way that we can just calibrate the value of those things and provide that value, literally the money and funds to do that, give that to the city, and allows us to sort of implement in the work that we do. So again, I emphasize that as just an example of the productive conversations and some things that we agree that for us that is a useful thing, and we agree that was a great opportunity to kind of influence the way we're going to implement these guidelines. Next slide, just again talk about where we're going. The draft came out with the UDO back in June, all of the engagement things I've just described, and just to emphasize, to try not to make it any confusing, but there's separate, this is sort of on a separate track than the policy strategic plan I was talking about earlier. So just a simple way to think about this is the streets manual is specifically tied to the implementation of the UDO, and so we're simply following the same schedule. There'll be again, a public hearing that's set up for July 11th, and then with the anticipation of adoption of the UDO later in August. So again, tied to the UDO and really following the same schedule, a little bit different than the policy map we talked about earlier. So I think that's it. That was a lot to cover with the goal that I just wanted to emphasize the past engagement that built this work, some of the engagement that we got to kind of help us refine it in the next drafts that just came out, and then just to kind of hopefully clarify the process for these two things moving forward. So I'll stop. I'm glad to have questions and discussion.
Okay, thanks. I wanted to ask you two things. Do committee members I don't see anybody's hands up. Okay. I have two questions. One, on the, going back to the strategic mobility plan, I know it's not meant to identify the projects right now, but how will you prioritize those? So is it going to be based on, what's the criteria? Is it based on Vision Zero? Is it based on, what's going to kind of lead that process for how the actual projects, when they do come up, how they get prioritized?
Yeah, no, and it's a great question. It's something we have. I didn't emphasize it in this presentation, but it is embedded in the draft plan. And really what we've done is use those 6 goals that we had: safety, connectivity, sort of access, and really the primary goals that came from the comprehensive plan. We're going to essentially use those to define the metrics by which we will prioritize projects. We do that today, so it's not a new thing. So as an example, we have a prioritization criteria. I think it was, discussed with council as recently as the budget discussions this past year, where we prioritize sidewalk investment, based on connectivity, safety, access, leverage with other development. So really what this is sort of, again, an update to how we prioritize projects holistically, not just pedestrian, and use really the basis of the comprehensive plan, taking those 6 goals, defining metrics. Safety is one of those goals, so we'll define specific metrics around the data that we have around the high injury network, where the needs are, and using that to kind of quantify where we want to prioritize projects. So we didn't get into all the details of those metrics, partly because one of the things we want to be is nimble. So the data that we get and the kind of metrics that can be defined sort of year by year somewhat evolve. And so what we really wanted to establish in this plan is that basic structure with the notion that we'll define more specific metrics as we move forward.
Okay, thank you. And then the second question I have is regarding the traffic impact studies. So I think it's, this month in our zoning meeting, we have 2 hearings coming up that, already we're hearing from residents that too much traffic, Highway 51's already difficult. So one's at Highway 51 across from the high school, the other one is at the intersection of 51 in Providence. And, we've brought this up before, but with the changes in the traffic impact study, is there a way to still say, we've got a couple of things going on here at one time, so that you take them collectively and say, this is too much, or it's fine, because that's residential, that's business, that's commercial, whatever. But I still have concerns about that. I like that you've changed the threshold so that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but it still worries me that we have things in the pipeline or even coming up at the same time that will have a duplicative effect.
Right. In this conversation around cumulative impact and kind of how it relates to other development that's occurring on a corridor, it gets sort of specific and technical, but it's in this draft plan in the manual, where we define, how we evaluate other projects. So an example where we have a rezoning, we do look at other, both projects that have happened and been approved recently and other projects that are on the horizon. And we have that scoping of that analysis designed to include those projects. So I want to make an emphasis that we do already, and in this draft manual, have a couple things like that where we're ensuring we're looking at it as holistic as we can around corridors and places that are fast growing, and looking at the projects that are happening recently around them.
Okay, maybe it would be helpful to put notes like that in our rezoning packets, so that we know that you all have taken that into consideration when you make recommendations.
No, that's a great point, and you're right. We aren't probably clear about that in the summary of the analysis that we do for rezonings.
Right. Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions on that topic before we move on? Mr. Driggs?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just make a comment because I don't want to hold up the committee meeting. But if you think of the 2040 plan and the UDO, one was kind of a vision statement and the other was the rules around it. This sounds like it's some sort of an odd mix of the two. So To me, a plan is a thing that says, this is where we are, this is where we want to be, this is what the city would look like when we're, and here is what the progress that we expect to make. So what I can't glean from all of this is simply, what is the city going to look like in 5 years as a result of this? And what will it take to get there? There's no accountability around the realization of all of these things. If you look at that picture of the avenue with the wide sidewalks and the bike lane and the planting strip and everything, that is very expensive. And there are many places, a lot of places in Charlotte that are intended to look like that and don't. So I think we ought to be more realistic about what kind of changes the plan will drive and when we can expect to see them. And Madam Chair, to your point, particularly on the subject of traffic, I still don't see in the UDO or in this plan a basis for anticipating some relief on the subject of traffic. We have a general concept that we're going to move to other forms of transportation, but this is the kind of thing that is going to take investment and is going to take a real will. And therefore, we should be realistic about how we expect to progress towards these goals and what it's going to take to achieve them. So I'm just offering that right now as a comment. I don't want to discuss it in this meeting, but I think when we get to full council, if we're calling this a plan, it's got to have some sort of accountability and a timeline for the progress that we intend to make. Otherwise, it will sit somewhere, and the resources won't be there, the developers will resist it, and people won't migrate to those other modes of transportation the way we hope they will. This is still a vision to me more than a plan. It's a good vision. I appreciate the work that's gone into it, but the really tough question here is how do we actually make all this happen? Anyway, just a comment. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Driggs. With that, we will, if there's no other questions, we'll go ahead and move on to back to Mr. Lewis for the Lynx Silver Line ULI study.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. We're pleased to be before you today to discuss what is probably the most exciting project that CATS has embarked upon in its history, and that is connecting the town of Matthews through Uptown and out to our airport and beyond. That project that we've entitled as the Silver Line. For the last 2 years, we've been in design and engineering of the project, and as a part of that process for coming up with the best overall alignment, we took a step back and brought in some external experts utilizing the Urban Land Institute. And so a couple of months ago, a panel of experts from around the nation, both from a transportation, land use, and real estate and development aspect, came into Charlotte, spent a week with us, really helping us dive into the intricacies of this project. We asked them specifically to look at the Uptown area and how the locally preferred alternative alignment would transit through Uptown Charlotte. We've received their draft results, and we are excited about the refinements that they've helped us make. Now, we're not at a point where we have made final decisions, but we wanted to outline for you what those recommendations were and our response to that, and outline what the next steps forward as we continue to work on this project. With me today are Kelly Goforth, the Director of the Office of Planning and Project Development, and Andy Mock, who is the Project Manager for the Silver Line. And I will turn it over to Andy to go through the presentation.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Council. I'm going to give a brief overview for the ULI process and one specific recommendation, and also talk about what we've done and kind of what it's looking like and then where we're going. But before we get into the details of that, maybe take an opportunity just to kind of step back and say, how did we get to the locally preferred alternative in Center City? And so that really goes back towards the system update back in 2018 that had a specific evaluation of the Center City connection for the Silver Line. And really, it was looking at primarily at how can we get a one-seat ride from Matthews in the southeast to Gaston County in the west as the driving goal, and also to hit Charlotte Gateway Station. So those were like kind of two of the high-level goals of that planning analysis. As part of that, they came up with the 11th Street corridor, and that from planning level design had us mostly at grade, meaning that the light rail was running parallel to 11th Street, close to the street, with lots of cross street crossings of the Silver Line. So they really only looked at full continuous east-west alignments that hit Charlotte Gateway Station. In 2020, we took that and said, okay, how is the best way for us to engineer and implement that, really with a view of implementation? How can we deliver this project that was planned through the system update? And really, when we got into the details and the weeds of it, we were really looking at minor variations. We didn't open up every particular alternative. We were looking at how's the best way to configure the Silver Line, mostly vertically. Should we take it up higher? Should we take it down lower? Is it okay where it is? Or just different shades of gray in between? And that analysis really led us to an alignment proposal that was adopted by the MTC that was mostly elevated through Center City along the 11th Street corridor. Really what that means is it certainly improved the reliability of the system, but it had an increased cost and created new technical challenges, but was foreseen before. It's also at the same time when we were starting to look at phasing implementation, looking at different ways to deliver the project in pieces rather than as one big entire project. In 2022, then as John notes, ULI came in a review of the 11th Street corridor, and they noted a couple challenges regarding that multimodal transfer between the Blue Line and the Silver Line, created by the aerial guideway. And they also made recommendations for opportunities to lower the cost and increase ridership by evaluating interlining. And I'll give a brief summary of what that means. Next slide. So these next two slides are ULI slides, the Urban Land Institute. This slide shows the 4 questions that we asked the panel to opine on. And the first was, how can you make the stationary development opportunities better along 11th Street? Would another alignment be better than the 11th Street alignment? How can you optimize the connection between the Blue Line and the Silver Line? And what sort of benefits does the First Ward Station create that was recently adopted? So those were the 4 specific questions that we asked. ULI came back with a very broad amount of recommendations, feedback that was way beyond this regarding other aspects of transit outside of Center City based on what they heard from their stakeholder interviews. Next slide. This slide just shows their overall mobility recommendations. They really are talking about improving transit in Center City as a whole and really coming up ways to improve the 2030 plan and get broader community buy-in on that. They talked about redoing the Brookshire and I-277. They talk about putting bus lanes on Independence and improving the Gold Line, improving transit as a whole, transforming street right-of-ways to really make them more transit supportive, and building coalitions. So they took a much broader view on the 4 questions that we asked. But within those recommendations, you can go to the next slide. Within those recommendations, there's really 4 high-level specific Silver Line recommendations. There's a lot of very detailed Silver Line recommendations, but at this level, at a kind of a high-level alignment level, there's really 4 of them that they recommended that we evaluate. And the first one is to evaluate alignments where we lower the Silver Line in such a way that we create more of a streamlined transfer. It's something that we've heard from council and the mayor over the last couple of years to how can we make that transfer as seamless as possible between the Silver Line and the Blue Line. Also, to connect some of the stations, we also heard in previous presentations concerns about stations being too close together. ULI also shared that recommendation or shared that concern and recommended combining 3 stations into one to create kind of a multimodal hub. That, more conversation about the airport terminal connection was heard by the stakeholders, so they definitely made that recommendation for evaluation. But the big one that we really jumped onto is the one that kind of has holistic improvements, is really the idea of interlining the Silver Line onto the Blue Line. And really what we're talking about there is when the Silver Line comes along Independence Boulevard around the Brookshire Freeway, the Silver Line trains would then merge into the Blue Line and run on the same Blue Line tracks and stop at the same Blue Line stations as we currently operate on, and then veer out to get to the west. Next slide. So this one is really the focus of our initial evaluation of the ULI recommendations that were provided to us. And by evaluating this, it really solves a lot of other challenges that were noted by the ULI team in their evaluation. Next slide. So really when we took this and we got their draft report and we saw their recommendation, their public recommendation, or public presentation, we really looked at this in kind of two ways. Does it fit and does it make sense? Could we do this if we wanted to, and does it make sense to do it? So really the first test is, does it work? How many different options are there that merges into the Silver Line? What sort of technical challenges are created by merging into the Silver Line onto the Blue Line? How can you get to the west? It's a challenge. It's more straightforward to get in from the southeast than to get to the west. And are there any fatal flaws? Well, then once we kind of had a feeling for that it mostly works, does it make sense? What are the ridership? What are the benefits? What sort of cost savings might we get? And what sort of ridership benefits could we get? Also starting to look at some high-level traffic screening. What does this do to traffic? Because if the Silver Line and the Blue Line are on the same tracks, that means the gates come down twice as often. So that is going to have a traffic impact. So we started looking at that, working with CDOT to determine what those impacts might be. How might the transit operate? That's an ongoing conversation. All of these things are ongoing conversations. Starting to think through how that might work. And then start to really do some stakeholder engagement, getting people understanding what the potential options are here. So what's next, where we are today, is really to provide initial findings of that interlining screening, that feasibility study, to figure out what we've learned over the last couple months. We're going to do that to TAP today and to the MTC this month, and then to finish out and develop that study approach moving forward. Next slide. So there's a whole lot on this screen as far as lines, and this is kind of just to really show you all the options that we have evaluated as far as interlining. We're going to have specific slides of each one of these, so don't get too caught up in each one of these. But just as a note, the red line kind of comes in and merges into the blue line from, if you can see from Independence Boulevard, the red line from the right side comes in. The purple line is the currently adopted locally preferred alternative for the Silver Line. The blue line is the Lynx Blue Line. And really when we started to look at this, the initial thought is merging the red line onto the blue line, and again, we'll have some specific maps that will be more clear to show this, and then merging out on Carson Boulevard, so you can have one seat ride from the southeast to the west. But really what we learned early on is that with all the development along Carson Boulevard, is really the Carson Boulevard opportunity to leave the Blue Line for a one-seat ride is really no longer there. There's so much development have happened over the last 4 or 5 years. And so the punchline from our initial phase study of this is really that there is really no opportunity any longer to have a one-seat ride from the southeast to the west. And I'll show some specifics for why that is. Next slide. So this shows kind of at a high level the transition that we would have to make from the Blue Line to get to the west via Carson. And this is the alignment that was studied back in 2018 as part of System Update. And really, initially, the notes are those red boxes are imminent development that are being planned right now and are in varying states of permitting and construction. So there's really no opportunity to make the alignment transition from the Blue Line to the west without having a direct and imminent impact on these large-scale developments. So that's a kind of a red flag right off the bat. There's also some significant challenges, even if we could overcome that, if money were no object. There's really not a great opportunity to have a new station, so we would have to take the old Carson station out to make that curve back at the Blue Line. And the space that was available for a new Carson station on Carson Boulevard is no longer there because of all the new development. So even if we could overcome the red boxes to take out those sites to give ourselves a guideway, there's really not an opportunity for a new station or even a station at Carson Boulevard at all. And even if we could abandon the station, which I think would be challenging, the operational characteristics of operating on Carson Boulevard, even for these 4 or 5 block section, would be really challenging for the public and for transit operations. It would be a very narrow section. It would run kind of like a streetcar operation. So it'd be very undesirable operations from a light rail perspective on Carson, even if we could overcome those other 3 things. So with that, we've kind of said that we feel like that this Carson alignment is excluded because of those 3 challenges. Next slide. So then the question that we really looked at, well, how big of a deal is that? How important is that 1-seat ride between the southeast and the west from a ridership perspective? So we did some traffic analysis to determine what that impact might be. What you see in front of you is a map that really breaks up the Silver Line into 3 zones. On the left, in the yellow polygon, is kind of the west zone. The green is the center zone, center city zone, and the blue is the southeast zone. Really, the subject of our analysis is how many people do we really think are going from the southeast to the west? And really what our findings are is really very, very few in the overall scope of the Silver Line. So most people, as you can imagine, about 79% are going from either the southeast or the west to Center City. Employment-based trips is a primary driver or entertainment-based trips leading that way. And about 15% are going within the same zone, within southeast to southeast or west to west. And only really about 6% are going from the southeast to the west. So with that, with the exclusion of that Carson Boulevard alignment, with this data fact leading us to that fact that there's really not that many transit ridership markets that are really being lost. We feel like it's still a good option for further evaluation, even if you can't have a 1-seat ride between the southeast and the west. Next slide. So now these next series of slides are really to show a little more clearly what the alternatives that are being evaluated are. So this shows the Phase A, which is the locally preferred alternative from Charlotte Gateway Station to CPCC Levine in the town of Matthews. This is the baseline today as adopted. That's about a 19,200 ridership per day in 2050 horizon year. In our cost, estimated at 5% level, is about $5.4 billion for that project. So that's the baseline that we're going to compare the other alternatives to. And then we have one for a Phase B as well. So next slide. So when you compare the interlining version of this, and again, the red line shows the interlining, which would come up along Independence Boulevard, around Brookshire, and then merge into the blue line near 12th Street. That really shows a pretty significant ridership increase of about 17%. And really that's caused by serving the employment closer to Center City more directly, and also serving the Charlotte Transportation Center more directly, and all the special events within South End and Center City. So that terminus would be at Carson Boulevard. So you would be able to have a 1-seat ride between Matthews, Bojangles, Plaza Midwood, Uptown and South End with this option. And it would have a pretty significant cost reduction of about $1 billion. And that's primarily because the loss of the bridge. That aerial guideway that would go from Central Avenue under the LPA the whole way to Charlotte Gateway Station would be cut in about half or a little bit more. So there would be a significant cost savings and a significant increase in ridership. So a pretty good alternative for further evaluation, certainly. Next slide. So now, the Phase A is pretty simple and straightforward. There's not a whole lot of different alternatives. It kind of lends itself to it, but the West is more challenging, and there's a couple different alternatives that are under evaluation. So I'll go through those right now and tell you kind of our initial thoughts of them. So from Phase A, from an LPA perspective, from the Phase B, Charlotte Gateway Station to I-485, that's about 10,000 riders per day, so less riders are anticipated on the west, but also less cost, about $3 billion of capital cost. So next slide. This alternative, instead of having that connection through the Fourth Ward area, really has the Silver Line Phase B following along the western alignment as similar to as we have right now, but then merges into Trade Street and would interline with the Gold Line between Charlotte Gateway Station and the CTC. And so that would have a pretty significant ridership increase as well, about 26% of additional riders. The cost, it would be slightly less, but it would be very similar to that of the Phase B. Now, that cost does not include whatever improvements are required to make the Silver Line West more reliable. I know that's something that council and CATS and the city are actively discussing for the Gold Line. So there could be some synergy in the way that we're thinking about Trade Street and the Gold Line improvements as it relates to the Silver Line. So that does not include that. But it also does have a limitation on the type of vehicles or light rail or type of transit vehicles that we could use. Operating within Trade Street would limit the type of vehicle to mostly a streetcar type vehicle if we were to use existing tracks and existing stations, unless we were to modify any of the tracks or stations. So that would have a capacity constraint on the Silver Line. We don't know the impacts of that constraint yet. That would be some of the work that we do over the summer months to get a little more into the weeds and figure out how big of a deal that is. But that's just a note that doing this option, which would have a great ridership increase, would create a little bit of a capacity issue that have to be resolved. Next slide. The next two slides are just different variations of a similar theme, which is instead of merging into Trade Street, you would then terminate at Charlotte Gateway Station in different capacities or different variations of that. So that would resolve that capacity issue of running on the Gold Line or Trade Street, but it would allow you to use your light rail vehicle of choice. So you could run here and then, but you would have to have a transfer then between the Silver Line West and the Gold Line to get to the Blue Line or the Silver Line. So it would basically induce a double transfer. With that double transfer, there would then be a ridership loss. So we would go from 10,000 riders per day to about 7,300 riders per day, forcing that transfer. So that's certainly something that would be very concerning for an alignment that would already has ridership challenges. Losing any ridership will be a big deal. It also would then be disconnected from the rest of the Blue Line. So it would create operational inefficiencies of having to have your own fleet basically, because it would not be connected to either the Blue Line or the Gold Line directly, which would certainly be challenging and increase your costs. Next slide. And this option really shows a very similar type of a scenario. This just shows the exact LPA as we have it now to the west, and this would allow you to have an integrated station within Charlotte Gateway Station. So there would be a benefit of having that fully integrated station into Charlotte Gateway Station. But all the other aspects of it would be similar, ridership loss and a cost increase because of that maintenance inefficiency. Next slide. So now that we've kind of looked at all these options and we kind of have a suite of options, we start to look at and gravitate based on our stakeholder feedback, which options do we think make the most sense from an implementation perspective. And really want to take a pause and look back and say, well, what does each one of the options capture? What are we losing and what are we getting if we pursue these interlining options? So we literally looked at the LPA and the stations and what they serve versus the Phase A and Phase B scenarios that we're discussing. And really the big change is really by pursuing an interlining vision, you're really capturing more employment. You're capturing over 30,000 more employees on a daily basis that could be riding your system. Your walk shed is improved because the street network is so much better in Center City. And you actually can get more vacant underutilized property because you're then the station along 12th Street in your first ward is actually on the other side. It's actually on the Brookshire side. So it allows you an opportunity to catch more and capture more on the northern side of the Brookshire. You do lose a little bit of population and households around the fourth ward area, but in really the big increase is really the employment that you actually gain. Next slide. And from a station perspective, the real loss is Graham Street. By pursuing interlining, you then lose the Graham Street station That's the only thing that's not duplicated in the interlining option from the LPA. And we started to look at, well, how big of a deal is that? So most of the area in Fourth Ward is really captured by Gold Line or Blue Line, Silver Line anyways. You're really losing that area for TOD development and station access. And that blue blob to the top, that's really the only area that's not within a walkable area to a station. And most of that area is encumbered by the CSX right-of-way or the Brookshire Freeway. So there's certainly some challenges in that area. You would lose a little bit of access to the NC Music Factory, which would be unfortunate. But we feel like we can provide service to NC Music Factory in other ways that wouldn't have as large of an impact. One thing to note is that the LPA going through the historic district in Fourth Ward is going to be challenging, and we meeting with the public, there certainly are concerns about building that bridge through the historic district. So it might be a more sensitive, lighter touch to pursue something that's not an elevated guideway through the historic district. Next slide. From a traffic perspective, I think one thing to note is that in our conversations with traffic, with CDOT, is that there is going to be traffic concerns in the future, no matter what. So it's with or without the Silver Line, there's going to be challenges in Center City. And CDOT's opinion, and I think most folks' opinion, is that it's going to be critical for us to provide alternative means of access into Center City to bring relief to the system. There are certainly concerns in CDOT's initial look at the crossings, especially at 5th, 6th, and 7th, and specific like in the morning and the afternoon. We feel like we can work through some of those issues, and we don't feel like there's any red flag issues in there. We feel like there's certainly challenges that can be to be overcome, but there's mitigation that we can evaluate with CDOT and with CATS and the way we operate this system that we can continue to evaluate. So we feel like traffic is not a red flag type of an issue on this alignment. Next slide. Regarding ULI, there were your recommendations. It's one thing to note. Evaluating and aligning checks a lot of boxes. It checks one of the biggest boxes that ULI noted, which it creates many transfer stations. So every station, every Blue Line station from 9th Street to Carson Boulevard would now be a transfer station. So you could get on at, say, Trade Street Station, and you could either go on the Silver Line to the town of Matthews, or you could go on to UNC Charlotte at every one of those stations. So that's a big benefit there, because providing that transfer mobility option is really effective. It does potentially create a good alternative to improve our cost effectiveness, both from a ridership and a cost perspective. There is opportunity for it to be part of the Gold Line solution on top of other initiatives and challenges that the city is pursuing for how to improve the Gold Line. It does improve the station spacing, so it kind of addresses that one. It would then also have direct service to the CTC, so it would address the concern or the recommendation to have a transfer hub. And it would provide a linkage to the north side with the station at 12th Street. So it really would check a lot of the boxes that were noted by ULI. Next slide. So just at a high level, the kind of the findings, our initial findings summary, is that from alignment, certainly challenges, but we feel like all of them could be overcome with more design. And it does greatly improve the station connections between the Blue Line and Silver Line. Ridership, we think, is like a big part of this story. Really increasing ridership by serving that employment directly in Center City is a big benefit, and a potential really big benefit in cost savings for the Phase A. Not as much of a savings on the Phase B. From an operations perspective, there are impacts. The LPA had an elevated structure, so very reliable. No opportunities or very few opportunities to impact that. So having both rail lines on one track creates a kind of a single point of failure. So if something were to go wrong on the Blue Line, it would also go wrong on the Silver Line. So we just have to accept that. From a systems perspective, we feel like most of the challenges there could be overcome. We would need some power upgrades, but we feel like that's a big deal in the scope of things. Traffic, again, feel like we can work through those issues. From an environmental perspective, that's a very big benefit of evaluating the interlining, because of the the concerns about the historic district in Fourth Ward. From a land use perspective, you lose the Graham Street station, but we don't feel like that's that big of a deal. One thing to note is that the Charlotte Gateway station would then be transitioned into the second phase and from the first phase. That's something I know that there's been concerns raised. But it would open up some additional development space along the Smith Street and 11th Street corridor that was ongoing work with developers in that area that could be moved forward without the Silver Line. Next line. So our draft staff recommendations really are to, we don't see any fatal flaws for Phase A, certainly challenges to be resolved, and we feel like there are significant benefits that would encourage us and our team to continue to evaluate that project or that alignment. From a Phase B perspective, there's multiple alignments out there that we have to kind of get with our team to really figure out which way we want to go with that. But again, we don't feel like there's any fatal flaws. So our recommendation is to initiate conceptual design on the Phase A, really to bring that up to a level that's similar to the LPA, and then initiate a planning analysis for Phase B. And then to really determine which one of those alignments we feel like makes the most sense from a community perspective. And then to solicit some public input on that, to have a public meeting, and we're shooting for early October for that public meeting. Next slide. And so, as far as the study timeline, we're still kind of working out the final scope of this with CDOT, and our other stakeholders. But most of the work we would anticipate to be in the July through September timeframe, where we're really bringing up that Phase A design work up to a level of 15%. To bring our Phase B planning analysis and really do a lot of that technical work to evaluate which one of those alternatives we like. Also, this is also be part of the peer review. They will be reviewing this alignment and providing their opinion on interlining with their experience from agencies who do interlining. It's not an unusual type of an operation. And then we would do our public engagement in October, have some early MTC outreach in October, and then November through January, go back to the MTC for information or action, whichever alignment is chosen. Next slide. And that's the end of my presentation. Any questions?
Thanks, Sandy. Do we have any questions? We've got Mr. Phipps. Oh, welcome, Mr. Phipps. Oh, he's not a committee member. I'm going to go to Mr. Eggleston first, and then we'll come back to you, Mr. Phipps.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Thank you, Andy. Two questions. One, on the interlining with the Gold Line and talking about you either have to upgrade the facilities we have for the Gold Line to allow for the vehicle to share it, or you said a more streetcar-like vehicle, I believe. If in the more streetcar-like vehicle scenario, does that significantly decrease the speed of the vehicle when it's not interlining with the Gold Line tracks?
No, Councilman Eggleston. The vehicle is a very similar vehicle to the Siemens S70, which is a light rail vehicle. The streetcar vehicle is very similar. It operates very much the same. That's really driven by the guideway and how much of a dedicated guideway you have. So the more outside of the center city along the west, where we would have a sealed corridor for the most part, we would be able to operate at a similar operating speed as light rail.
Okay. And I know we're probably too far down the path now for this to be a viable option, but I'm curious to hear a more detailed answer than I've heard before on this, because I think the question will be asked. What level of due diligence did we ever get to in exploring going around 277 in the other direction? So 74 and then merging into a more southern route around 277, which then turns into Wilkinson Boulevard. I think that question is likely to be asked, and I'd like to have an answer to provide, because particularly, and we wouldn't have known this some years back when we started down the path of the preferred alternatives that we have now, but with the medical school and the innovation district over on that side of Uptown, kind of over near Metropolitan and up towards Moorhead, there certainly would be some positives along or around an alignment like that. Another connection into the south end or in that general vicinity, you still have the connection to, you know, Bank of America Stadium, things like that. Did we get very far down that in terms of due diligence?
Well, I'd have to kind of refer back to the system update from 2018. I know that that team evaluated several different alternatives that looked like that. So I'd have to get back to you, Councilman Eggleston, about what the details of that analysis that they did previously in 2018. But my understanding is that that was part of the analysis, an alignment that looked like that.
Yeah, I think it was. I don't know how strongly it was considered, and I don't recall what were identified as the sort of deal breakers for that being viable. So yeah, that's not urgent, obviously, but I think it would be helpful for us as we inevitably get that question, particularly given investments being made in the innovation district with the medical schools. So that'd be helpful to have later on. Thank you.
We'll take a look at that.
Thank you. Mr. Graham, did you have any questions?
I'm fine, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Phipps?
Yeah, could you specifically identify the shared stations between Silver and Blue Line when it links up with that interlink?
Yeah, could you go back to the slide, the first Center City alignment option, Phase A slide? I think I'm not sure which number it is. But these stations, while she's doing that, the stations that would be shared in this scenario, go forward 2 more. That's it. There you go. Perfect. Thank you. So in this scenario, the shared stations would be the 9th Street station, the 7th Street station, the CTC station, the 3rd Street station, the Stonewall station, and the Carson station. We're still kind of like operationally figuring out like how Carson would work because it would be a terminus operation. So we might have a transfer station there, like a separate station. That's something we're still evaluating how that would exactly work. But there would be an opportunity there, whether it's as part of the same station or a separate station, to be able to transfer right there.
Oh, okay. Now, I know several months back, Mr. Lewis had indicated that we had room enough for another station. But did I understand you to say that that's out the window now?
Mr. Andy, I'll take that one. Mr. Phipps, when you're talking about a room we are planning an additional station on the Blue Line further along the Blue Line in South End around the Publix area. So that is the additional station that we're adding to the Blue Line. In terms of this interlining option, initially we had thought that we could transition, as Andy mentioned, directly from the Blue Line to the west corridor, heading out Carson to Wilkinson, and continue with that 1-seat option. But the development, as Andy mentioned, along Carson Boulevard in that area prevent that from occurring.
So we're still on track for the station near Publix, but not necessarily at Carson.
That is correct. The Publix station is 3 or 4 stations further to the south.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And we have Mayor Lyles is online as well. Welcome, Mayor Lyles. Do we have any?
Thank you. I'm just listening, so didn't want to miss the opportunity to hear the comments and the questions.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. If we don't have any other comments from council members or committee members, I will just add a few. I appreciate this alternative. I really think it hits on a lot of things that we've expressed are important to us, in particular with giving people from the Silver Line access to Uptown. So I appreciate that. I think the trade-off of employment versus households seems to me that employment is a more reliable predictor, correct? if you're going to take the light rail to work every day, you're probably taking it for the most part every day versus households is probably a little bit more unpredictable. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. I think it gives us that predictable commuting trip, despite how changed as a result of the pandemic. The commuting patterns have changed, but I think if given a choice, we'd rather have more employment opportunities, and we can offset that with the lower number of households.
Great, okay. The Graham Street TOD development, again, I'm not positive about this, but it feels like that area is developing anyway. So maybe it's not a huge loss from a development standpoint, given how valuable that area has become. But I know you'll get some folks that will want to see, especially the Music Factory up Camp North End. So I hope that we will have some sort of a solution with, I'm not sure if that's really first mile, last mile, but transit solutions to get people over to one of those lines.
That's correct. I think we would put that as a part of our bus priority study. How do we make those first and last mile connections, both to the Blue Line and to potentially Gateway Station and the Gold Line under this scenario?
Okay, great.
And I would just add that it is on the edge of the walk shed to the Gold Line, the Grand Street area. So they would still have access to the street.
Thank you. And thank you for reminding me of that. Can you define walk shed for anybody like me who doesn't really know what that means?
I believe they defined it within a quarter-mile walk of the station.
Okay, so it's a perimeter within a quarter mile, and that's called the walk shed?
It's actually taking the pedestrian path.
Uh-huh, okay.
You know, not just a circle.
Okay, great. And lastly, the at-grade crossings, I know that's going to be a challenge, but I'm hoping that for everybody frustrated with all those crossings, they'll decide they want to use the light rail instead of driving uptown. So thank you for the presentation, and I know we'll look forward to more as that develops.
Very good. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee.
Thank you. And then we're on to our last item, and we're almost on time, so, which is great. The last item is an update from our planning director, Allison Craig, on the UDO.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem and members of the committee. We're excited to be here today to give you an update on the UDO. We've spent the last number of months doing a lot of listening, having a lot of meetings with council and with different stakeholders to understand what challenges may have been presented in the first draft, what suggestions for changes that were made. We spent a great deal of time with you all in special meetings, and we really appreciate that additional time that council provided to us. The second draft really reflects the comments that we heard. As an example, we talked a lot about parking with you all and heard some of the concerns about not wanting to go to eliminating parking minimums in suburban areas, where we also heard wanting to really prioritize the areas where there are alternative forms of transportation and making sure that we're not overparking those areas. So we've made adjustments or not made adjustments according to that. So really feel as though the second draft really reflects a good balance in all the comments that we received throughout the community over the course of the first draft. So I'm going to turn it over to Laura, and she's going to talk a little bit about just the adoption timeline, key dates, what the public input process is, the different types of engagement that we have on the second draft that's available to the community, and then talk about some of the key changes that came from the first draft to the second draft. So I'll turn it over to Laura, who is the UDO project manager.
Thank you, Allison. I think as everyone knows, we released the second UDO draft, which is also going to be the public hearing draft on Friday, June the 3rd. We will, just to let you know, at public hearing, probably be bringing you a few suggested adjustments on things that maybe didn't end up quite the way we anticipated them in the second draft, things we need to tweak. But we will be moving forward with this draft with an addendum sheet. This is currently online, the full red line second draft on charlotteudo.org, the website for the UDO project. And as Allison said today, we want to talk to you about timeline, public input, and then Alan Goodwin, Deputy Project Manager, will be talking about some key changes between the first and second draft. Next slide. So a little bit about public input and our schedule. As I said, we released the draft on the 3rd, and we also opened the public comment portal for the second draft on that same day. We will, beginning tomorrow, be having public engagement opportunities. We'll have this week on Wednesday an open house. We'll have virtual update sessions tomorrow and Thursday. We'll be moving then in the next weeks into the virtual office hours where people can come in small groups or one-on-one as well to talk to us about what's in the draft, to give us their feedback. Staff will respond to feedback and will summarize comments for City Council and Planning Commission, Planning Committee, and we'll have that at the time of the public hearing, so you will know also what we have heard throughout the process. And this is the timeline. Just quickly, I won't go through the virtual sessions or the open house, the engagement, but some of the key time frame for City Council is we will be having the public hearing on July the 11th, and that will be in front of City Council and the Planning Committee of the Planning Commission. We will then, on July 19th, go to the Planning Committee and ask for their recommendation and come back and ask for a decision from Council on August 22nd. Next slide. A little bit on the input that we had received that led us to the second draft. Since the October release of the first draft, we received over 1,200 comments from community members and stakeholders. We've certainly spoken with council a few times, as well as the Planning Commission, our UDO advisory committee, and we've also gotten comments, a large number of comments from city and county staff, particularly those folks who will be administering the ordinance. So that has given us a lot to work with as far as updating and creating the second draft, which does build off of the first draft, but includes a number of new and updated concepts and approaches that we are bringing to the community now to review. So we go to the next slide. A little bit about how the red line draft works. So the draft that we have out is actually a red and blue line draft. Where we have added text, we have underlined that, we've shown it in blue and underlined it. Where we have removed text, we have shown that in red and struck through it so that everyone can follow where the changes are. And this includes anything of substance where there have been maybe just adjustments to references and so forth. We haven't done that, but anything of substance is showing up in the red line draft. Next slide. And now I'm going to turn this over to Alan Goodwin, who is going to talk about the proposed changes that we think are most impactful in the second draft.
Thank you, Laura. The changes that we're going to talk about today are listed on the current slide, but I'm not going to read through them all because we'll go over them item by item as we go forward with our slides. Next slide, please. So we've added a new campus district. It will be the 4th campus district in the UDO. It is the Research Campus District, abbreviated as RC1. And it's intended to address the needs and impacts of large-scale research campuses within a mixed-use environment. It should be noted that the proposed mix of uses in this research campus are not available or allowed in the other 3 campus districts. And this RC1 district is characterized by taller structures within a pedestrian-oriented environment. This district was added based on the feedback that we received, particularly as it relates to areas like the University Research Park. Next slide. The next change is a revised sidewall height restriction. Currently, in the first draft, we proposed that in our Neighborhood 1 zoning districts for new or infill development, that it would have, the new dwelling would have a maximum sidewall height of either 12 feet or the average of the sidewall heights of the dwellings on either side of it. We heard through our economic impact analysis as well as other feedback that the 12 feet would limit the ability to build two-story duplex or triplex dwellings in these lower density neighborhoods. And as a result, we are recommending increasing that minimum sidewall height from 12 feet to 20 feet. In the second draft, it would apply in the neighborhood 1 zoning districts as well as in our proposed residential infill overlay district. Next slide, please. We are introducing a new type of historic district called the Street Side Historic District. It's new for Charlotte, although it has been used in other communities. And the difference between this and the traditional historic district is that the Street Side Historic District would only regulate the first 50% of buildings and properties on the street side, so that from the street, we would regulate the ability to change and modify buildings, but in the back half of the property or the back half of the structure, you would be able to do things like renovations or additions without having the restrictions of the historic district regulations apply. So we think that this will perhaps open up the possibility of introducing this type of historic district in some neighborhoods that may have been reluctant to do this in the past. The process of establishing this new street side historic district and to make changes to structures after this has been introduced would be the same as the process that we're currently using today for historic districts. Next slide, please. We are proposing to modify the height transition between new development and a neighborhood 1 place type from that which we showed in the first draft. In the first draft, which is illustrated by the graphic on the top, which I know it's difficult to see all of that, but in the first draft, we propose to limit the height of new development within the first 200 feet of the neighborhood 1 place type lot line to 65 feet. And then after 200 feet, the development would be able to go to the maximum height allowed by whatever zoning district it was being developed under. We, based on feedback from council and other discussions, we have modified that so that in the second draft, for the first 100 feet of the neighborhood 1 lot line, we're proposing to limit the height of new development to 50 feet. Then after 100 feet, to go up to 65 feet, as in the first draft. And then again, after the 200 feet, after the first 100 feet of 50 feet height and the second 100 feet of 65 feet in height, the development would then be allowed to go up to the maximum height of whatever the zoning district is that the development was being built under. We think this provides a better transition between the neighborhood 1 place type and the higher intensity development that may be built near it. Next slide, please. So we've reduced some of the height in new development through that type of that revised transition. At the same time, we're proposing to add height where we think it's most appropriate, particularly in our centers. And so we have proposed new maximum heights in several zoning districts. Also, we're proposing to increase the maximum height with bonus in the bonus structures. And so depending on the district, that height may be a fairly minor increase, like a 5-foot increase, and others it is more significant, up to 50 feet. We've also reduced the minimum building height in our neighborhood center district from 24 feet down to 16 feet, and this reflects the reduced intensity of that neighborhood center district as compared to our other centers. Next slide, please. Short-term rentals generated more comments from the public than probably anything else in our first draft of the ordinance. We are currently recommending that we remove any proposed regulation of short-term rental, and by that we're talking about Airbnbs, VRBOs, Because of an ongoing lawsuit, Schrader versus the city of Wilmington, that may result in some better legal guidance for us going forward in the future. And so until we get some better guidance, the city attorney's office has advised us to remove any proposed regulation of short-term rentals from the current UDO. Next slide, please. Our bonus menu, which allows for increase in height or in some cases, reduced open space requirement that we're currently using in our TOD districts, is proposed to be expanded to several other districts, and those were shown in our first draft. However, in our second draft, we are proposing to add new options in the bonus menu, and that one would be provision of affordable housing at 60% of area median income, which is lower than the 80% that we currently have in the bonus menu. Also, provision of electric vehicle charging stations over and above what would be required ordinarily in the UDO, multimodal transportation mitigation, and transportation demand management mitigation. These new options will allow property owners to advance opportunities, or rather more opportunities to advance city priorities, including things like affordable housing at lower AMI thresholds, as well as advancing the goals of the Strategic Energy Action Plan and our Strategic Mobility Plan. Next slide, please. We are adding new affordable housing options designed to try to incentivize the provision of more affordable housing. They include the ability for development to utilize standards of a different zoning district, adjustments to the requirement to build streets under certain conditions, reimbursement for sidewalks when they are required along public streets, as well as alternative standards for green area and heritage trees. And we're working with our Housing and Neighborhood Services Department on setting new thresholds for target affordability levels, and we'll be bringing those recommendations to council later this year. Next slide, please. We've been working with Mecklenburg County Park and Rec staff to provide options for the requirement to provide on-site open space. And the options would be to dedicate land to county park and rec, or to provide a fee in lieu, which would go toward the acquisition of open space by the county. We think this greater flexibility allows development to meet open space requirements while also offering Meck County Park and Rec a direct mechanism to help achieve its broader goals related to land acquisition, connectivity, and recreation area development. Next slide. We had quite a bit of comment especially from the development community, about when and how requirements for open areas can overlap. And so we are clarifying that in the second draft to say that, and I won't read the whole list of requirements, but for new development, one or more of these various requirements may be applicable, and in some cases, they can overlap one another as long as they meet the individual requirements of each item. So, for example, if you have a requirement to provide on-site open space and you also have a tree save requirement, those two areas of the parcel may overlap as long as you can meet the individual requirements of the open space and also the requirements of the tree save. And the same would go for any of those areas that are listed there, that they may overlap, although in some cases maybe not completely overlap, but they may share some area of the site. Next slide. We have retained the recommendation for electric vehicle charging stations in certain zoning, in certain land uses in the second draft, but we have modified it to try to balance the cost and the community benefit that we think will result from this. So we have maintain the requirement for EV-capable and EV-installed charging facilities for electric vehicles where more than 9 parking spaces are provided as part of the development. But we have removed the requirement for EV-ready, thinking that it would add significant cost without really providing a near-term benefit. In addition, we have modified the definition of EV-capable to only require the reservation of space in the electrical room for future EV chargers in a continuous raceway to the future EV parking space, rather than actually providing the capacity in the panel. And we also want to call attention to Duke Energy's Make Ready program, which will significantly defray costs associated with installing EV charging stations. Next slide. We've adjusted some parking standards, but we are recommending for now to retain the basic 3-tier parking structure. This is our proposal after hearing council feedback, which was varied. We see that parking standards are something that we'll have to come back to and reassess over the next several years as the community evolves. But for now, in the second draft, our recommendations include simplifying the parking table by consolidating, where possible, uses that have similar minimum and maximum parking standards. We are generally increasing, or rather reducing, the minimum parking in our Tier 1 zoning districts for non-residential uses, but for our residential uses in Tier 1, our parking minimums have not changed from the first draft to the second draft. Next slide. Our Tier 2 parking minimums for non-residential uses have generally been reduced, and the minimum parking requirements for selected uses in Tier 3 in the first draft had a 200-foot distance where if you had a certain use and you were within 200 feet of a neighborhood 1 place type, you would need to provide a minimum amount of parking. We are increasing, or proposing to increase, that 200-foot distance to 400 feet in the second draft. And then finally, if you're doing a development that is within a half mile of an existing transit station, even though your zoning district may not fall into the Tier 3 parking standards, you would be allowed to use those Tier 3 parking standards, again, if you are within a half mile walk distance of an existing transit station. Next slide, please. We're proposing for the manufacturing and logistics place type to increase the maximum block length to 2,000 feet. This is a significant increase from the 1,500-foot block length that was in the first draft. And we're also proposing to add some flexibility for development to request an increase in the 2,000-foot block length to accommodate the design of buildings that may be proposed in that manufacturing and logistics place type. Next slide, please. We have added, working with CDOT, 4 new street classifications in the second draft for our uptown area. They are uptown signature streets, linear parks, uptown primary streets, and uptown secondary streets. These new street classifications are mapped on the Charlotte Streets map. And again, we've worked with CDOT to include these changes in the UDO to promote predictability in building siting and streetscape design in the uptown area. Next slide, please. And finally, non-conforming site elements, which we realized was a gap in the first draft of the UDO, so we've added a section in Article 38 for non-conforming site elements. And by site elements, we are talking about things like landscaping, fences or walls, or parking and loading areas. And such non-conforming site elements can continue and to operate as usual with normal maintenance and repair. Don't have to be brought into compliance with the UDO standards for those types of features. However, if there's construction of a new principal building on the site, all of those non-conforming site elements would then need to be brought into compliance with the current UDO standards. At this point, with our next slide, I'd like to turn it over to our Chief Urban Forester, Tim Porter, to continue.
Thank you, Alan. One key change, in addition to heritage trees, we wanted to inform council on was a change in where the tree protection regulations are located. In the first draft, there is a separate article, Article 29, of tree protection that included all development and non-development related tree protection standards. Upon internal review, council feedback, recommendations from the development industry, we decided to shift the tree protection standards into the landscaping screening article to, it's essentially a alignment and simplification strategy to locate all vegetation-related requirements in one place. We think this will greatly help staff and customers as they're using the UDO. The current tree ordinance is technically part of the zoning ordinance, so it made sense to keep that close connection between these regulations. And we will be leaving any non-development tree regulations in a standalone tree ordinance. Next slide, please. So the most prominent regulation that we've heard feedback on is by far been heritage trees. There are two key proposed changes in the second draft, essentially splitting the approach of how heritage trees are regulated in non-land development and land development scenarios. For non-land development scenarios, we are proposing to recommend removal in all cases, but require a permit and to shift to a more moderate or lower preservation intent and emphasize mitigation and tracking to ensure we have the ability to work with the community to get trees replanted, to better understand where heritage trees are located, how they impact the community, property owner decisions, and how they really, what value they have to Charlotte's tree canopy. Of course, if they're dead, diseased, dying, or hazardous, they can be removed in any situation without a permit. But this is a recommendation to allow removal of heritage trees in non-land development scenarios, which would be property owner decisions outside of the development process. Require a permit, mitigation fee, and mitigation replanting in those cases. We feel it's a better balance between preservation and tracking and mitigation, and it will give us time to better understand what these trees mean to the community, both from a decision-making perspective, but also from a ecological, environmental perspective. And the second area of focus will be land development scenarios. In those scenarios, developers will have more flexibility and predictability in developing their site, due diligence. The mitigation requirements will be a little bit higher in those scenarios. Developers would also have to demonstrate a conflict. They'll be allowed to develop whatever their by right development footprint is. They'll be able to develop to that completely as long as they meet the other tree requirements. Heritage trees may be removed in those situations, but a demonstrated conflict must be shown. Mitigation fees are a little bit higher, and we'll have a table in a second here to go through that. So next slide, please. Continuing on with the land development scenarios, left to right here is a table explaining where are we now, what was proposed in the first draft in the middle column, and the second column is what we're proposing in the second draft. So right now on the far left, we have technically a heritage tree regulation in the current tree ordinance, but it does not really do much. We average less than one heritage tree per year. That's because the current definition of heritage tree really focuses on champion-sized trees, state champion-sized trees. And they're just very, very rare across the entire state. In the first draft, we proposed a strong preservation approach in that middle column, top to bottom. Heritage trees would have to be required, or they'd be required to be preserved unless there's no other reasonable location. Results that came back in the economic impact analysis revealed that this regulation approach would prevent and greatly restrict development in many cases, so we felt the balance was not in the right place. The mitigation fee was $1,000 with one tree required to be replanted. There were no incentives to preserve the trees. It was more of a straight requirement approach. In the second draft, we're proposing more flexibility for these trees to be removed if a conflict is demonstrated. Additionally, proposing an increased mitigation fee for every heritage tree removed. There'd be a $1,500 fee per tree and minimum one tree replanted per tree. The ability to reduce that fee exists. Developers would receive a $250 credit per additional tree planted. And there are some additional incentives now. Preservation of specimen trees, which are large mature trees in a class just below heritage trees. So they're large, but they're not quite those stately, massive trees we have across the city, but they will be one day if developers preserve those. They'll receive that'll cover their mitigation requirement. Additionally, if preserving a heritage tree, developers would get double credit for the canopy of that tree towards meeting their tree save or green area requirement. And next slide, as we split this up into two different approaches, in the non-land development scenario or property owner decision scenario, we don't have any regulations now. This represents a large step. These are not development triggered. This would be a blanket protection approach. In the first draft, just like land development, we proposed these trees were required to be preserved unless there's no other location or a significant conflict. We're now proposing they can be removed, but a permit is required unless diseased, dead, or hazardous. The permit would also require submittal of a $500 fee from property owners and one tree being replanted on the property where the tree was removed from. That fee could be reduced, just like in development scenarios, by $250 for additional trees planted on a property where a heritage tree was removed. The mitigation fees collected through this process would support the new canopy care program the city will be developing that will focus on providing tree care assistance to underserved areas across the city, both targeting assistance for managing large mature trees. We've had a pilot project some years back that helped in the Wesley Heights neighborhood provide assistance. Tree care is very expensive for these large trees, so this makes sense to help residents maintain those trees. Another focus area of that program will be replanting of trees to make sure we have a sustainable approach when heritage trees are removed. We provide assistance in possibly removing them or taking care of the current trees that are remaining, but also planting back additional trees. We think that this heritage tree regulation may have a high volume permit process and additionally potentially a significant revenue stream for canopy care, the canopy care program. And that's our proposed changes for the second draft. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on heritage trees again.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that, Tim. Do we have any questions from committee members? How about from other council members? Mr. Phipps.
Yes, I wanted to be clear on something. It's been stated and several times that this ordinance applies to native trees. Is that true, or can you have another species of heritage tree, non-native, that you would get some sort of relief on?
We're proposing to focus the regulation on native North Carolina species as defined by the U.S. Forest Service. So there is a list, and we'll develop a guide for residents and customers that clearly or simplifies that list. But right now, Mr. Phipps, it's focused only on native North Carolina species.
So then are you saying then if you have a heritage tree, non-native, you got more flexibility?
Yes, unless that tree is located in another protected area like the public street right-of-way or in a tree save area. But yes, if it's just a non-native tree like a ginkgo in someone's front yard or backyard that's 30 inches in diameter or greater, the heritage tree protection would not extend to that type of tree.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Mr. Driggs, did you have any questions?
I did have a question about building heights, Madam Chair. I don't know if we can find that slide again. I'll just say what the question is. I'm wondering whether we have any understanding of what the magnitude is of that issue. Like how much development is affected by that? How big a difference does it make that we go to the solution proposed now? And I'm thinking in terms of just how many locations are likely to be affected by it. And I have raised this issue before. I think it's something we should understand before we just put numbers on those height restrictions.
Mr. Driggs, we are working on that information and will get that back to you. I think we want to also show where we can at least get an estimate of where there are height increases that are balancing out, though not necessarily always on the same site, but are balancing out that decrease next to N1. So if you don't mind, we will get that information back to you and to the engineer.
Thanks, Laura. I'd heard, I think, from developers that this could be fairly critical in terms of our desire to create more units, you know, if we cap these heights. And I just don't have a feel for how many buildings would actually be affected by these limits. So if you do come up with more information about it, I'd be interested to hear it. Thank you.
And I'd like to comment on that, Mr. Driggs and Ms. Harmon, because I think what we're talking about is that change in transition from N1. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, the picture we saw with the steps of
Right.
building height.
So I know I've shared a picture with my colleagues of a live example of what the impact actually is to have a single-family house next to, you know, a 5-story condo, which is allowed right now. And it's pretty dramatic. And that is, we've had some other residents send in photos and examples of what that would look like. I think John Friday, who used to be our Planning Commission chair, also sent in photos of that. And maybe that's more common when you get closer to higher density neighborhoods. So I'm not sure, you know, for me, it is very much of an aesthetic thing. When you look at having a single family house and all of a sudden you have no sunlight in the backyard anymore because you've got this huge building, I just think that I'm not sure, I want to say this properly. I think we have to bear in mind what it does to our existing single-family houses and not have such a dramatic change. And having that transition and then making up for the height difference further away, I think is a good balance for that.
Madam Chair, I don't disagree. I'm just saying I hope we could be a little more intentional about balancing our goal of protecting the single-family homeowner with our goal of creating as much housing as possible. And we have no feel for what the trade-off is or what the cost is in terms of new units we might create of any given height restriction. So I would just like to finalize that in the context of a better understanding of how our housing creation goal is affected by the heights that we adopt. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Driggs. If there's no other comments, I just want to make one comment on the short-term rentals issue. You all know that's been a real hot spot for a lot of us, both hearing from both stakeholder groups of those who want to be able to add short-term rentals in their backyard through an ADU or whatever, or part of their house, to neighbors who don't want that. So I do hope that we can get some clarity sooner than later as to, you know, even when those lawsuits are going to be heard, what specifically they are referring to. I thought Wilmington had to do with the number, I guess, like you can't have another short-term rental within 400 feet of an existing one, and so then it's sort of, well, who gets to have that kind of thing. But I just think there's a lot of other issues here that we really need to deal with pretty quickly as people really want to start using this this allowance to be able to have backyard dwellings and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. As soon as we get the go-ahead and working with the attorney's office, we'll be back with probably an alternative to what we provided originally.
And do you have any idea for the timeline for that, what that could be?
I don't off the top of my head. I want to check with them and see what they're hearing about Wilmington and potential appeals. I think that's our biggest question mark right now.
Okay. And this might be something that eventually the intergovernmental committee is going to have to take on and elevate it to work with our delegation at the General Assembly level, because it impacts us more, you know, and as Charlotte grows and becomes more of a tourist destination, which we hope it will, it's going to continue to become a more critical issue that might not be the case for other cities and towns. So, thank you.
Madam Chair, could I comment on that?
Yep.
I think we should consider the possibility of some action away from the UDO and not just tell everybody, wait, the UDO, we have to do this and that. It's possible that we could create some rules on a relatively short-term basis in the interim, because this is a pressing issue.
Yeah.
You know, I think we all get complaints about it all the time. And if we're talking about years before the General Assembly and all of those things happen, I'm wondering whether we're required to wait for all of that before we can do anything. It could just be that we crack down harder on the enforcement of ordinances we have, or that we modify the terms of some of our noise ordinance and parking ordinances and things like that, and simply get CMPD to intervene more aggressively or issue citations more aggressively. But I think just saying we're not going to do anything until these other events occur, which could take a long time, is going to be unsatisfactory to a lot of people. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Driggs. I think that's a great point. Let's look at other ways. Let's really identify what it is that troubles us the most. And you've had a few real high-profile ones in your district, Mr. Driggs. And that's not really, doesn't really have much to do with what happened in Wilmington and why they're going through the court process. But let's pull out what our problems are with this, and to your point, handle that separately and try to get some resolution sooner than later. I like that idea. Thank you. Okay.
I like that idea as well.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. And with that, if there's no other comments, that was pretty good. We're just 1 minute over. Congratulations, everybody.
Nice job. Well done.
Thank you. May I have a motion to adjourn? Mr. Eggleston?
So moved.
I'll second that. Thank you, everybody. See you tonight.